Hey history buffs! Today we're diving into how the world was divided after World War II in the 1945. The guns stopped first, not with a final roar, but with a tired sigh, as if the world itself exhaled. In ruined streets, dust settled in pale sheets over brick and bone. Across oceans, engines cooled, and ship decks gleamed with salt and quiet. Flags were raised, bands tuned again, and leaders stood at podiums to declare victory, yet the air felt thin, as if a room had been emptied in haste and nothing put back. On maps, the colors of empires looked faded, their edges frayed by years of strain. The war had broken more than machines. It had broken promises of order, of certainty, of how power should look. The United States emerged heavy with industry and food and steel, its fields unscarred, its cities unburned. The Soviet Union towered out of smoke with a will bolted to suffering, its dead counted in silent millions, its factories still hot from all-night labor. Between them lay a vacuum that seemed to pull at everything: ideas, armies, hopes. At train stations in Europe, people huddled with suitcases, unsure whether home still existed as a place or only as a word. Roads were a ribbon of returning soldiers and wandering children. The sea lanes reopened and carried not only cargo, but memory. It was a pause, not a peace. The wind that sifted through the ruins tasted of ash and anticipation. Relief made way for unease. In that lull, the future began to gather itself, choosing not trumpets or parades, but carefully stacked documents, whispered meetings, and maps drawn in pencil. If victory had an echo, it sounded distant, and in that distance, something else started speaking. What language would it use? The year acquired its own gravity, drawing events toward its center as if time itself wanted a clear dividing line. Factories in the American Midwest purred and shifted from shells to refrigerators, from bombers to automobiles with chrome futures. Men and women counted savings, bought small houses, and turned war bonds into beds and breakfast tables. Across the Atlantic, Europe measured loss. Cities were a geometry of absence, foundations like open books, staircases climbing to nothing. Britain stood upright but hollowed, its treasury light, its colonies restless, its victory priced in ration cards and debt. The Soviet Union leaned on a vast landscape where smoke still clung to the horizon. Wrecked villages were counted by the thousand, yet rail lines were hammered straight, and assembly lines spun under portraits that watched with stern patience. Japan lay more than defeated. It was reduced to a cold arithmetic. Bridges gone, neighborhoods flattened, schedules made of hunger and rubble. Into this arithmetic stepped administrators, soldiers with notebooks, economists with plans, and engineers with pencils sharpened like surgical tools. They took measurements of food, coal, timber, and steel. They measured morale, too, though they did not admit it. In classrooms where windows had no glass, teachers gathered students and promised a syllabus of rebuilding. In ministries where clocks ticked too loudly, new calendars were opened to a page with no writing. The world had survived. Now came the problem of arrangement. Should survival be protected by walls or by trust? When winter still held Europe in its pale hands, 3 leaders met near the Black Sea, insulated by guards, protocol, and the weight of expectation. Yalta was more than a conference. It was a room where geography learned to speak in clauses and commas. Around a table that smelled faintly of polish and tobacco, post-war arrangements were discussed with the sobriety of surgeons assigning roles in an operating theater. The Soviet Union asked for security in depth, a buffer of friendly governments along its western rim, shaped not by conquest, it said, but by necessity. The United States pressed for elections, institutions, and a charter for a new organization that might prevent wars from sprouting like weeds. Britain sought influence enough to remain a relevant gardener among larger trees. They spoke of Poland as if it were both a place and a promise, of Germany as a patient to be divided among overseeing physicians, and of liberated countries as laboratories for political remedies. Agreements were made, sometimes in plain words, more often in language that could bend without breaking. The ink looked permanent on paper, yet everyone could feel how soft it was beneath their fingertips. Outside, the sea rolled in slow slate-colored waves, indifferent to drafts and signatures. The cameras recorded smiles that did not reveal the teeth behind them. Yalta became a hinge on which doors could swing either way. Which direction would the next door open? By summer, the war in Europe was over, and the meeting moved to Potsdam, where villas carried the echo of earlier music, and gardens held the scent of cut grass. The cast had changed. The logic had not. Germany was now a problem with quadrants, each administered by a victor who imagined order in his own image. Boundaries, reparations, and trials filled the agenda like heavy stones. The Soviet Union had bled to win a seat at the head table. It demanded ballast for its security. The United States had tested a weapon that turned the sun into a brief, man-made judgment. It carried that knowledge like a sealed envelope in a breast pocket. Britain felt the strain of time and empire, its new leaders taking notes while heirs to colonial offices cleared theirs. Maps were spread, pencils tapped, and phrases such as spheres of influence gained the shine of practicality. Decisions seemed straightforward. Demilitarize, denazify, democratize. Yet beneath the verbs lay incompatible meanings of the same nouns. In one vision, democracy required parties within limits. In another, it required limits on parties. The electric hum of the future was faint but present. As trains ferried displaced families past fields where tanks had once slept, a postal service of ideology began delivering messages to capitals across the continent. The meetings ended with statements that sounded definitive, but in back rooms, the arithmetic continued to shift. What would the sums reveal when the numbers were finally still? Words have the power to turn moods into landscapes. The phrase that soon spread across headlines, an iron curtain, had the simplicity of offense and the gravity of a verdict. It was not at first a wall of stone or steel. It was a temperature change, a new set of permissions, a different vocabulary in border towns. In Eastern Europe,
Coalition governments narrowed to single parties that grew used to unanimity. Police stations became places where questions were asked in low voices and answers recorded with careful neatness. Newspapers learned to prefer certain adjectives. In the West, fears hardened into plans. Aid proposals were drafted with the cadence of generosity and the rhythms of self-interest. In the middle, the literal middle, Berlin became a mirror where opposing systems could see themselves reflected and opposed. Rail lines carried not only coal and grain, but metaphors of reliance. What divided Europe more than checkpoints was the sense that each side saw in the other not only a rival, but a diagnosis. Revolutions of housing blocks and steel quotas appeared to one side as progress, to the other as constraint. Meanwhile, families visited different cousins under different flags and learned to count time by whether an envelope arrived this month. The curtain was not yet visible in concrete, but it was felt in how people moved, where they worked, what they dared to say at kitchen tables. How long can a shadow exist before someone builds a lamp to match it? The atom, once a quiet inhabitant of diagrams and equations, stepped onto the stage as a symbol that spoke louder than generals. The bombs that ended the war in the Pacific made a geometry of light no camera could truly hold. In the aftermath, an emblem was born, a trefoil to warn, a mushroom cloud to caution, a promise of energy bound to the threat of annihilation. Strategy changed its verbs. Deterrence replaced charge. Containment replaced conquest. Ambassadors read technical reports with the anxiety of weather forecasts. Laboratories became bastions, and scientists learned the grammar of classification alongside the language of quanta. In classrooms, children practiced crouches beneath desks, not because desks could protect them, but because rehearsed movement calmed the mind. Command structures lengthened their chains of authorization, yet everyone knew that the chain ended with human judgment under impossible time. The bomb made diplomacy heavier, giving silence a new meaning, turning delays into signals and pauses into policies. International bodies debated control schemes, inspection regimes, and shared custody of secrets like a family with an heirloom too dangerous to display. Each proposal contained within it a suspicion. Each suspicion sharpened the proposals. The atomic emblem hung over the decade like a second moon, pale and constant, illuminating paths that might otherwise remain dark. But moonlight also distorts distance. What looked near could be far. What looked far could be a step away. Which distances were real? For many nations, choice was not a gesture, but a calculation. The hunger graphs were steep, the winter forecasts unforgiving. The American offer of aid came as a list of shipments, credits, and machines, accompanied by a thesis about open markets and stabilized currencies. The Soviet promise arrived as contracts for coal, oil, and manufactured goods, paired with a thesis about planned growth and protected frontiers. Governments read both with weary eyes, then measured them against flooded fields, idle factories, and crowded tenements. In parliaments from Rome to Oslo, debates rehearsed the moral vocabulary of freedom and equality, while budgets spoke bluntly of grain and electricity. In Prague, Paris, Athens, and beyond, unions, churches, and newspapers aligned their headlines with the pantry's reality. For many, neutrality felt like a bridge with no foundation, alignment like a safe harbor with compulsory rules. The choice, once made, altered textbooks, holidays, and radio programs. Military missions taught not only tactics, but habits of mind. How to read a map, how to schedule a convoy, how to define security. The new alliances were not carved in stone, but in routine. People discovered that routine, repeated long enough, looks like a border. Yet these borders remained permeable to culture, music, and rumors, moving by train and transistor with a stubborn independence from policy. If necessity had chosen, could it ever be unchosen?
Berlin's map resembled a puzzle designed to test patience. A divided city deep inside a divided zone, it invited experiments in leverage. When land routes were closed, the city did not fall silent. It listened harder. The air began to hum. Propellers carved corridors through clouds, each flight a line on a ledger that totaled hope in tons. Coal descended like black snow into waiting hands. Milk arrived in bottles cold to the touch, a luxury made possible by precision and the resolve of schedules that did not sleep. On the ground, people learned to live by timetables posted in doorways like liturgical calendars. Streetlights dimmed to preserve power. Ovens went cold at certain hours. Conversations evaluated aircraft types the way farmers judged weather by clouds. The blockade was a lesson in arithmetic and endurance, in whether an equation of pressure could solve a political problem. It did not. When the barriers were lifted, it was not a triumph announced by trumpets, but a release of breath that had been held for too long. The city remained a knot in the rope, proof that supply lines could be more alliance, and that endurance could itself become a form of alliance. Yet the knot also tightened. If a city could be held without tanks, could the rest of Europe be arranged the same way? Assistance arrived not as a single ship, but as a fleet of strategies. The plan, named for an American general, traveled like a merchant prayer. Spare parts, flour, locomotives, turbines, wire. It brought accounting methods and production targets too, and encouraged cooperation across borders that had so recently been trenches. Committees met under new fluorescent lights, comparing output charts pinned to cork boards. Engineers from different languages learned to point at the same numbers. Food queues shortened. Steel output rose. The plan was more than money. It was a rosary of confidence. European recovery gathered pace in factories that smelled of oil and reclaimed optimism. For some, the aid carried a shadow, suggesting dependency. For others, it suggested partnership. In the East, the offer was declined on behalf of many, the strings described not as support but as nets. Alternative integration deepened there, measured in 5-year pledges and freight trains heading east by night. The difference between the two systems became visible in small things: shop windows, timetables, the availability of spare bulbs. Diplomats observed these details with the keen interest usually reserved for troop movements. They understood that habit shapes belief. As cranes swung over new shipyards and bridges, European politics stabilized into patterns that would last decades. But recovery solves the last problem by creating the next. What would this new prosperity be used to defend?
Security, once an informal promise, became an institution with headquarters, emblems, and articles. The North Atlantic Treaty gathered states into a mutual assurance that an attack on one would be answered by all. The language sounded simple, compact, and solemn, like a lighthouse rule written on brass. Officers trained together, maps were standardized, radios synchronized. In response, or in parallel logic, the East formalized its own collective security, a pact that translated shared ideology into shared command. Exercises marched across plains in both blocks, mirrored like choreography performed on opposite stages. The machine rooms of defense multiplied, logistics depots, radar stations, early warning nets that stitched the sky into a grid. Ordinary life absorbed these structures as background: a base near a town, a convoy at dusk, distant thunder that was not weather. Children learned the acronyms before they learned some rivers. The treaties promised stability, but they also drew lines that could not be easily revised. Inside those lines, politics learned to navigate with caution, and crises learned to travel along known routes. Rivalry settled into an architecture. Architects, once asked to rebuild homes and schools, now designed bunkers and blast-proof corridors. The geometry of Europe became a geometry of commitments. Across that geometry lay a constant, quiet question, the one insiders asked in briefings and citizens asked in their sleep. When alliances promise peace by preparing for war, which part of the promise arrives first? Out of the administrative zones and the arithmetic of ration cards, two states emerged with deliberate names and careful charters. In the West, a basic law framed a provisional republic that promised federal balance, individual rights, and a tether to Western institutions. Currency reform turned gray paper into new notes that smelled of ink and hope. Shop windows filled overnight with goods that seemed to appear from thin air, but were in fact released from storerooms waiting for confidence. In the East, a people's republic formed with a different grammar: planning boards, mass organizations, and a security apparatus that learned fast, watched long, and took notes in meticulous script. Factories were merged into combines, fields were reorganized to match new agricultural theories, and streets were renamed to reflect heroes arranged along a new calendar of meaning. Berlin remained a divided pupil in a divided eye, where each side explained itself by pointing to the other. Rail schedules adjusted to politics. Postage stamps became micro-lectures in sovereignty. The border hardened not instantly, but by habit, guard post by guard post, list by list. The memory of one nation did not disappear. It became a hinge that creaked each time families met at stations and counted hours, permits, and the weight of packages. Reconstruction gave both states legitimacy, but legitimacy wore different uniforms. The two stories moved forward on parallel tracks, listening for any tremor on the other line. If the tracks narrowed, what pressure would build where they met? Across the Pacific, occupation became a structured calm. Orders arrived with stamps and signatures, but the daily work felt domestic. Rebuilding rails, reopening schools, remapping ministries. A new constitution, rooted in translated principles and local debates, outlawed war as an instrument and redefined sovereignty as civic discipline. The emperor remained as symbol, not command. The cabinet governed by procedure rather than decree. Land reforms cut large estates into smaller holdings that smelled of freshly turned soil and new possibility. Factories, at first quiet, began to thrum, learning to produce with precision for markets abroad. American bases dotted the archipelago like guarded lighthouses. The security guarantee freed budgets for industry, research, and the slow art of quality. Textbooks adjusted their narratives. Students learned a civics of restraint and participation. Culture traveled both ways: jazz above ramen stalls, baseball in city parks, literary magazines reviewing translations with earnest care. The memory of the bomb lived in memorials and annual silences that made the present feel provisional and precious. As the Cold War tightened in Asia, Japan's role as a workshop for peace aligned with a strategic calculus that preferred factories to fleets. The archipelago became an experiment in prosperity tethered to dependence, autonomy bound to alliance. In this balance, stability took on a sober beauty. But balances shift with winds beyond the islands. When neighboring storms gathered, how would this chartered calm hold?
On the mainland, the Civil War's last campaigns pushed across plains and rivers, and the political center moved with the marching lines. By 1949, a new government stood in Beijing, promising unity, land to the tiller, industry to the people, and dignity after a century counted by foreign intrusions. The revolution recast institutions and calendars, the old capital's lanes filled with slogans, inspections, and the careful distribution of scarce goods. Across the strait, the defeated government hardened itself on an island base, vowing to remain the true repository of the Republic's name and memory. The world split in recognition, some capitals shifting embassies, others holding their ground, all reading the same change through different lenses. In the countryside, land reform turned into campaigns that measured ideology and loyalty alongside harvests. In cities, factories reorganized around targets and teams. The border with the Soviet Union offered training and models, yet the partnership carried its own quiet rivalries, masked by communiques of unity. For Washington, the vastness of the mainland now sat within a new chessboard geometry. For Moscow, a partner enlarged the socialist map, but also introduced a second center of revolution. Asia's balance shifted, as if a plate beneath mountains had moved. If the world had divided once across Europe, would a second seam now run through the Pacific? On a peninsula, cut at the 38th parallel by hurried wartime agreements, The pause between systems broke. War returned, not as a total conflagration, but as a concentrated lesson in Cold War logic. North and South mobilized under banners that condensed history into directions. The United Nations, summoned by procedure and absence, assembled a coalition that treated the frontier as a test case for credibility. China, reading the river as a warning line, entered with waves of volunteers. The Soviet Union influenced from a posture that mixed counsel with caution. The front moved like a hesitant tide, advancing, retreating, freezing in winter mud. Cities changed hands, then counted the cost in bricks and names. Air power wrote contrails above villages that learned to read the sky for danger. On maps in faraway capitals, staff officers traced arrows with rulers. On the ground, soldiers learned how limited wars are unlimited for those inside them. When the guns finally quieted in 1953, an armistice line was fenced and mined, and a demilitarized zone, ironically, became one of the most militarized symbols on Earth. The conflict settled nothing final, yet it established a pattern: proxy combat under nuclear shadows, diplomacy as ceasefire management, victory redefined as non-defeat. The peninsula remained a reminder that division can harden until it looks permanent. If this was the first lesson, how many revisions would future classrooms require?
While armies drilled, broadcasters tuned. The war for allegiance learned to travel by voice, poster, and film. Radios whispered past curtains, carrying news read with calm certainty from opposite studios. Cultural programs offered symphonies and folk songs, book clubs and language lessons, careful invitations to imagine the other side as either generous or dangerous. Film festivals curated visions of modernity, kitchens gleaming with appliances, tractors plowing straight lines across collective fields, skyscrapers rising in steel grids, kindergartens arranged in bright order. Schools taught civics with diagrams of institutions or charts of planned output. Scholarships moved students across oceans to study sciences that were also philosophies. Architecture learned to speak in glass and concrete, in Baroque of the people, in international style, each silhouette a soft manifesto. Even sports became a channel for ethics, teamwork as freedom, discipline as equality. Passport stamps and touring ballet companies carried more subtle freight than they declared. Inside living rooms, families negotiated their own interpretations, mixing admiration with skepticism, comfort with doubt. The competition did not always persuade, but it saturated. And saturation, over time, forms layers hard to excavate. If images and syllabi can build borders in the mind, what erases them when the transmitters go quiet?
Beneath the speeches, intelligence services extended their reach like roots seeking water. Files multiplied in gray cabinets. Networks formed in capitals and ports, universities and unions, always under other names. The age of covert action began with memoranda that justified the extraordinary as necessary. Funds to favored parties, guidance to newspapers, whispers in parliaments. In Iran, a crisis over oil and sovereignty ended in an operation that restored a monarch and reassured companies, while also imprinting a memory of intrusion on a region that would remember long past the headlines. In Guatemala, land and ideology became intertwined with fruit and freight. A government fell, and the vocabulary of intervention expanded. In Eastern Europe, security services perfected techniques of surveillance and selective pressure, ensuring that opposition remained fragmented, cautious, or silent. The public record showed stability. The private archive told of pressure applied at critical joints. These actions laid pipelines under the political landscape, moving influence like a commodity. They kept the peace of surface order while priming future storms. Citizens developed a second literacy, attuned to rumor, code words, and the weight of a knock at night. When policy travels through shadows, accountability grows thinner. Outcomes blur into unintended consequences, and history acquires new blinds. If the unseen becomes decisive, how does a society learn what really happened?
The Eastern Mediterranean and its deserts entered the post-war world with mandates expiring, borders finalizing, and populations on the move. The creation of a new state in 1948 rearranged maps and identities, setting refugees in columns across roads and igniting wars that taught the superpowers caution and curiosity. The Suez Canal, a narrow cut of water with global consequences, became a stage in 1956 for conflicting claims of sovereignty, prestige, and maritime order. A tripartite intervention met American disapproval and Soviet warning. And the crisis ended not with battlefield verdicts, but with diplomatic recalibration. Oil turned geology into strategy. Pipelines and tankers outlined a web whose strands led to refineries, factories, and suburban commutes far away. Monarchies and republics sought to modernize with revenues that glittered like promises, while clerics, officers, and merchants competed to define how modernity should look under desert stars. The Middle East became less a single question than a set of equations whose variables were belief, land, and price. What happens when arithmetic is correct, but the answers are human?
On the subcontinent, independence arrived with flags raised under monsoon skies and with trains that became moving borders, carrying millions in opposite directions after a partition negotiated at speed. The new states inherited institutions and wounds, both demanding immediate attention. Constitutions to draft, economies to stabilize, identities to narrate without exclusion. In the wider Asian and African world, leaders compared notes and found a shared desire not to be pulled into either bloc's orbit. By 1955, in Bandung, a conference staged a new vocabulary: non-alignment, peaceful coexistence, anti-colonial solidarity. It was not neutrality in a vacuum. It was choice as assertion, sovereignty framed as policy. The movement did not prevent wars among its own members, nor did it guarantee economic miracles, but it offered an alternative stage on which to speak of development, dignity, and distance from tutelage. South Asia balanced relations with both superpowers, purchasing machinery from one, accepting food aid from the other, cultivating a strategic ambiguity that itself was a strategy. Domestic politics oscillated between central planning and market improvisation, between secular ideals and religious mobilizations, each turn watched by neighbors and distant capitals alike. The Third World, as a term of hope and hierarchy, entered textbooks. If a middle path could be paved, who would maintain it when the weather turned?
Across a continent long drawn by others' rulers, flags were stitched and unfurled in quick succession. Ghana's independence in 1957 announced a tempo. Within a decade, dozens of new states joined the family of nations, each with a capital that learned the rhythms of anthems and debates. Borders inherited from colonial surveys contained multitudes, languages, histories, economies specialized to serve faraway ports. The new governments faced twin tasks: nation-building inward, development outward. Universities opened with faculties of agriculture, engineering, and history. Ministries struggled to reconcile budgets with expectations. Rural clinics placed thermometers gently beneath tongues and found fevers of need. In some territories, liberation came through negotiation. In others, like Algeria and Kenya, violence wrote its own minutes and left scars that spoke longer than speeches. The Congo crisis revealed how decolonization could draw in the superpowers under the cover of peacekeeping and advice. Each move watched by corporations counting minerals and contracts. Ideologies competed, but so did bureaucratic capacities, weather patterns, and the price of copper. The Cold War's map overlaid itself upon Africa's emergent atlas, sometimes supporting, sometimes distorting, often complicating. The promise of sovereignty was real. The constraints of inheritance were stubborn. When a state is new, but its problems are old, which learns faster, the institution or the impatience?
Western Europe, nourished by aid and trade, grew into a pattern that blended markets with social protections. Parliaments hammered out compromises that transformed war economies into welfare states. Pensions accrued like quiet promises. Health systems took root with clinics lit by fluorescent care. Schools expanded, graduating technocrats to staff a burgeoning integration project that began with coal and steel and aspired to a community of law. Eastern Europe consolidated under parties that measured success in output and obedience, building housing blocks that rose in measured rows and factories whose smokestacks synchronized with five-year charts. Yet the order was not immovable. In 1953, workers in East German streets tested the system's tolerance and found answers as tanks. In 1956, Budapest erupted with a plea for a different socialism and met armored rebuttal.
The message that followed was twofold. Reform might be discussed, but not on the streets. The air tightened, then relaxed into routine again. People adjusted, recorded small victories of everyday life, and cultivated private gardens of thought. In 1961, concrete and barbed wire in Berlin turned a porous frontier into a visible doctrine, a wall that admitted ideology could not compete for hearts without controlling feet. The continent's arteries reorganized around checkpoints and conferences. Under the surface, questions circulated in kitchens and salons. If stability requires walls, what happens when someone imagines a door?
In the early 1960s, a small island turned into a mirror for global intentions. Revolution had arrived there with beards, literacy campaigns, and a defiant posture toward the hemisphere's oldest power. In response, embargoes tightened, exiles organized, and the shoreline watched boats that carried not trade but purpose. When missiles appeared by secret agreement with a distant ally, reconnaissance photographs converted palm groves into launch geometry. The world learned new phrases: quarantine, escalation ladder, and back channel, as if vocabulary could domesticate danger. For 13 days, clocks seemed louder. Naval vessels traced circles on blue charts. Warheads were counted in hypothetical futures. Leaders exchanged letters that were read like weather reports for survival. The outcome was withdrawal, promises, and the quiet installation of a telephone link meant to shorten catastrophe. Nothing had been fired. Everything had been threatened. The Caribbean proved that superpower proximity could make the globe small, that a single harbor could hold the balance of deterrence. Afterward, both sides acquired a sober respect for edges. Yet respect did not mean retreat. The island kept its course, exporting doctors, trainers, and a style of defiance. The continent kept its policy, rotating sanctions with watchfulness. The crisis passed, but it left a rule. Confrontation could be contained until it wasn't. If a narrow strait could nearly crack the century, what might a river, a desert, or a mountain pass still hold?
Far from the Caribbean, a long S-shaped land took center stage. Its war predated the superpowers' deep involvement and survived their strategies. The conflict mixed civil contest with international alignment, jungle with bureaucracy, ideology with village loyalties. Advisors escalated to battalions. Battalions escalated to divisions. Firepower measured progress in body counts that revealed little about control. The North integrated aid from socialist partners, moving supplies along trails that defied maps. The South tried to build institutions while fighting an enemy that could be everywhere and nowhere. Helicopters threshed the humid air. Television carried images into living rooms continents away, adjusting public patience. Bombing campaigns sought to compress will. Instead, they dispersed it. Negotiations in Paris moved like careful chess under fluorescent lamps. When withdrawal finally came, it was a process rather than a moment, and the final scenes were not victory arches with helicopters above rooftops, boats heavy with hope, and a country unified under one flag at a cost known best by its own people. The war left a lesson that did not fit neatly in doctrines, that that modern armies could reach their logistical limits before reaching political success. It also left after images, immigrants remapping neighborhoods abroad, veterans remapping memory, and strategists remapping ambition. If a superpower could meet its limits in a small country, where would restraint next be learned, and by whom?
Within the socialist camp, unity proved conditional. Geography, history, and pride separated two revolutions that had once exchanged manuals and solidarity. Border skirmishes along icy rivers hinted at deeper dissonance. One power anchored in European strategy and centralized planning, the other redefining revolution as permanent mobilization, then later as pragmatic opening to trade and technology. Treaties were reread with suspicion. Aid programs were suspended. Slogans adjusted to new adversaries that shared old friends. The split created new openings in the global map. Some countries used it to bargain, courting one capital with the shadow of the other. Others recalibrated ideology, publishing textbooks that taught careful distinctions. For Washington, the divide presented a chance to triangulate, to speak with Beijing in the language of shared constraints rather than shared values. For Moscow, it required longer supply lines of influence and a fresh accounting of where its doctrine reached and where it did not. The Third World watched with a mixture of relief and caution. Rival patrons meant higher bids, but also more entanglements. When borders inside a bloc become frontiers, alliances become less like fortresses and more like markets. But markets fluctuate. If a second horizon opens, what happens when the two horizons do not meet?
Above the noise of ground politics, rockets lifted toward a new arena where atmosphere ended and symbolism began. First came beeps from a metal sphere that circled the earth like a clock without hands. Then came dogs, capsules, and cosmonauts whose smiles floated against instrument panels. The other side answered with capsules splashing into oceans and moon missions calculated with slide rules, mainframes, and courage distilled into checklists. Space was research, but also theater. It displayed systems capacities to educate engineers, to manage complex supply chains, to guide national focus without explicit coercion. Materials science advanced in laboratories that smelled of resin and ozone. Weather satellites reshaped farming. Communication satellites stitched continents into live broadcasts. Imaging from orbit turned forests and oil fields into data sets. The race culminated in footprints pressed into lunar dust, televised into bedrooms where viewers felt both national pride and species wonder. Yet even here, the Cold War lingered. Missile technologies were cousins to launch vehicles. Treaties for celestial bodies read like cousins to those for seas. The cosmos offered a second vantage, a quiet where borders looked like faint scars on a bright sphere. The view encouraged humility. The budgets encouraged competition. If space could be shared in silence, could Earth learn to echo that tone?
In 1968, a small Central European country attempted to conjugate socialism with freedom.
Newspapers experimented with candor. Writers tested the limits of criticism. Planners explored economic reforms that mixed targets with markets. The world watched a laboratory where loyalty and liberty might coexist. Tanks arrived to close the lab. Intervention by allies framed the event as fraternal correction, asserting the doctrine that each member's path must conform to collective security. The season of debate collapsed into winter rules. Censorship restored, parties disciplined, reforms undone or slowed to a crawl. Yet the experiment left residue. It inspired dissident movements that learned to be patient and meticulous, to publish samizdat, to form civic committees that documented the ordinary with extraordinary fidelity. It taught reformers elsewhere that timing mattered as much as content. For Western observers, it reinforced a bleak conclusion that change within the bloc would be managed from above, until above itself changed. But conclusions have their own half-lives. The memory of the spring survived in bookstores, kitchens, and jokes, the small repositories where political climate is measured with human thermometers. If grammar can be taught by force, can it be unlearned by time?
In the 1970s, the price of a barrel became the lever of a global classroom. Conflicts in the Middle East, paired with producer coordination, sent costs upward in a way that exposed the veins of industry and suburb alike. Lines of cars idled at gas stations. Thermostats were turned down. Factories recalculated break-even points. Inflation crept into shopping lists and union contracts. Petrodollars pooled in banks that sought borrowers, financing highways and skyscrapers far from the wells. Energy policy transformed from quiet planning to prime-time debate. Nuclear plants took shape beside rivers. Conservation entered schools and showrooms. Research into solar panels left lab benches for rooftops. For developing countries without oil, the decade demanded new arithmetic: export earnings versus import bills, debt service versus social spending. International institutions devised facilities and packages, acronyms that tried to cushion shocks with conditional loans. Meanwhile, producer states built modern capitals at speed, their skyline a blend of glass, marble, and ambition. They discovered that wealth drawn from the ground also attracted new expectations from the ground up. The shocks ended, but the repricing remained, adjusting how distance, speed, and growth were counted. If energy is the hidden script of modernity, what story unfolds when the punctuation changes? After years of crisis, the superpowers experimented with lowering the thermostat. Summits produced photographs of handshakes under chandeliers. Arms talks drafted frameworks that limited launchers, separated missiles from defenses, and installed verification as a new verb in diplomacy. The Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty acknowledged a paradox. Vulnerability could be stabilizing if it was mutual and understood. Grain deals, cultural exchanges, and joint space missions suggested that rivalry could be wrapped in routines that humanized the other side without de-weaponizing intent. In Europe, the Helsinki process gathered states to recognize borders, human rights, and principles that, though non-binding, traveled like seeds.
Not everyone approved. Hawks on both sides suspected illusion. Dissidents insisted that human rights clauses were promises to be collected. Smaller allies feared being traded as abstractions. Détente did not end competition. It gave it protocols. Those protocols proved fragile when events tested their premises, in the Horn of Africa, in Afghanistan, in parliaments where ideological suspicion could be summoned by a single speech. Still, détente left something durable, the idea that oversight, counting, and corridors for communication could make hostility legible. If temperature can be managed, what happens when someone opens a window?
The Western Hemisphere, south of the Rio Grande, experienced the Cold War as alternating seasons of reform and repression. The Alliance for Progress promised growth through planning and partnership. Military regimes promised order through uniformed certainty. Guerrilla movements read manuals and jungle terrain. Counterinsurgency learned to combine civic action with fear. In Chile, a democratic experiment in socialist policy met a coup that reset the economy toward markets and the polity toward control. A template watched by neighbors and students of strategy. Across the region, foreign capital built factories and highways, while local elites and unions negotiated over shares of a growing but uneven pie. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, debt piled like storm clouds, interest rates abroad turned upward, and austerity arrived in budgets that had no fat. The International Monetary Fund became a household term, not for its technicalities, but for its consequences. In the shadows, the disappeared marked a ledger that no auditor could balance. Yet civil society persisted, church committees, human rights groups, newspapers testing censors, planting pressure that would later sprout into transitions. The continent learned that ideology traveled with balance sheets, and that both could be overruled by demographics and dignity. If discipline can stabilize numbers, can it also stabilize memory?
On Africa's Atlantic coast and Horn, wars unfolded with local roots and international branches. Angola's independence birthed a conflict in which rival movements drew support from opposite poles of the global divide. Their struggle reinforced by Cuban troops, South African incursions, Soviet advisors, and American covert aid. In Ethiopia and Somalia, ideology and border claims intertwined with famine and relief, teaching the world how televised images could mobilize donations even as governments measured gains in airstrips and ports. Mozambique, Rhodesia, and South Africa each followed different timelines toward liberation or reform, but all bore marks of distant strategies layered atop nearby grievances. Amid the fires, patient builders worked, teachers under trees, nurses with sparse supplies, administrators keeping civil registries legible despite upheaval. Pan-African institutions attempted coordination, mediating where possible, and condemning where necessary. The superpowers learned that influence could purchase commitment, but not coherence. When the Cold War later cooled, many of these conflicts persisted,
proving they had deeper aquifers than ideology alone. Yet even in war, roads were paved, languages standardized, and a generation educated. If proxy flames are fanned from abroad, who owns the ashes and the first green shoots that appear through them?
As the contest matured, information became both treasure and terrain. Satellites unrolled film canisters back to Earth before digital eyes learned to count pixels. Listening posts mapped airwaves that hummed with encrypted traffic. Dead drops in parks shared space with antennas on embassy roofs. Inside ministries, analysts correlated fragments, cargo manifests with payphone calls, grain harvests with rail schedules, defector stories with photographs stored in gray envelopes. The other side did the same. Computing arrived as cabinets of humming circuits, then rooms of tape reels, then terminals glowing phosphor green. Algorithms sorted weather from signal, modeled blast waves, optimized factory output, and eventually managed inventories for supermarkets that became tiny theaters of affluence. Education systems bent towards science and mathematics. Scholarships and institutes multiplied. A generation learned to think in code as readily as in prose. Surveillance reached inward too. Citizen files thickened where state security equated stability with knowledge. Dossiers accumulated on desks that never quite emptied. Privacy, once a function of distance, became a negotiation with systems that did not sleep. The new machinery promised control. It also created vulnerabilities, software bugs, leaks, and the simple courage of those who copied papers at night. If power depends on seeing, what happens when the lenses multiply faster than the understanding of what they show?
At the end of the 1970s, a land of high valleys and stone villages became the latest crossroads for global designs. A coup, followed by reform imposed too quickly, opened a fissure that widened under pressure. When Soviet troops crossed mountain passes and airlifted into bases under winter light, they carried the habits of a continental army into a terrain that disassembled formations into outposts and patrols. Resistance grew from tribes, religious schools, and commanders whose authority ran on kinship and reputation. External patrons turned the struggle into an artery of weapons, cash, and training, seeing in each rifle an entry in a broader ledger. Refugees flowed over borders into camps that became cities of canvas, with classrooms built of plywood and chalk. Helicopters stitched the sky, mines stitched the soil, narratives stitched identity to sacrifice. In Moscow, the war added weight to budgets already strained. In Washington, it was read as a chance to bleed an adversary without a direct clash. The conflict reshaped Pakistan's frontier, Iran's calculations, and the Gulf's security posture. When withdrawal came nearly a decade later, it left a vacuum deeper than the footprints of departing columns. The mountains kept their silence. The networks kept their momentum. When a proxy war ends without a settlement, what stories continue to march in the dark?
While one part of the world burned, another carefully aligned its instruments. Western Europe, having stabilized democracies and rebuilt economies, moved from coal and steel to customs unions, from common tariffs to common institutions. The Treaty of Rome turned tariffs into history.
Bureaucracies in Brussels translated principles into regulations that smoothed borders for trucks and ideas. Farmers learned a new vocabulary of quotas and subsidies. Manufacturers planned across markets that began to look continental rather than national. The Single European Act sought to complete an internal market, codifying the invisible, standards for plugs, rules for competition, mutual recognition of professions. Schengen began as an experiment at select crossings, where barriers lifted like eyelids, and travelers discovered that freedom of movement could feel like ordinary convenience. Skeptics worried about sovereignty dissolving. Advocates spoke of peace made habitual by shared paperwork. Currency debates hinted at a future in which exchange rates would not flicker. Courts arbitrated across languages with a resilience born of procedure. Integration was not a parade, it was a rhythm. Committee meetings, directives, compliance reports that gradually redrew expectations. The project acquired a quiet audacity, peace through interdependence, prosperity through predictability, identity layered rather than replaced. But could a union built on rules carry the weight of crises not yet imagined?
Poland, with a history of partitions and uprisings, offered a civilian blueprint for dissent. Shipyards became forums where workers articulated demands that mixed wages with rights, bread with speech. The independent union that emerged gathered membership like a tide, nesting within churches, apartments, and workplace committees. Negotiations produced accords that granted space for organization within a system built to avoid such space. The experiment frightened those who saw one concession as a breach of the whole design. Martial law descended, with curfews and arrests, tanks idling beneath street lamps that cast long shadows across snow. Yet the underground adapted. Printing presses moved, lectures shifted to living rooms, the economy of trust expanded to include couriers, lawyers, and priests. Western broadcasts carried news and music. Eastern censors redoubled their vigilance. The people learned to mark anniversaries with candles and silence. Over the decade, the costs of managing an unwilling public mounted, as did the costs of an economy misaligned with its own promises. When roundtable talks finally convened, they reflected not capitulation, but arithmetic. A society had learned the patience to insist, and a state had learned the limits of force. If a compromise could be written into law, could it rewrite the region's future grammar?
In the early 1980s, rhetoric sharpened, budgets swelled, and the arms race received a new lexicon. The United States accelerated procurement of missiles and bombers, revitalized alliances with maneuvers and basing arrangements, and announced an initiative that imagined interceptors in the sky and sensors in space. Supporters of the plan framed it as a vision to make nuclear weapons obsolete. Critics saw technological daring paired with strategic destabilization. The Soviet Union, confronting a long list of commitments, subsidies to allies, the Afghan war, a vast conventional military, and a brittle consumer economy,
answered with its own build-up, but at mounting opportunity cost. Europe felt the pressure in its streets, where hundreds of thousands marched against deployments, and in its cabinets, where leaders parsed deterrence with precision. The decade's tone was stern, its metaphors mechanical, windows of vulnerability, escalators of conflict, ladders of escalation. Yet behind the machinery, fatigue accumulated. In both blocks, citizens measured the benefits of security against the absence of progress at home. The strategic defense debate revealed a paradox. Even as weapons became more capable, the belief in their use as a policy instrument diminished. How long can a contest expand when the appetite for its ultimate test keeps shrinking?
Leadership change in Moscow brought a revision to the script. Perestroika promised restructuring, an economy less suffocated by command, more open to initiative. Glasnost promised transparency, discussion of past errors, present problems, and future choices. These were not exits from history, but re-entries into it, an attempt to preserve socialism by exposing it to air. Diplomacy shifted too. New thinking approached security as mutual rather than zero-sum, signaling readiness to reduce arsenals and to resolve regional conflicts. Withdrawal from Afghanistan began as a sober correction. Dialogue with Eastern Europe became less prescriptive, quietly replacing obligations with options. The reforms released energies that had been contained. Nationalities asserting identity, journalists testing boundaries, citizens forming associations with names that had long been unsayable. The system's rigidities resisted even as its organs relented, producing a tension between center and periphery that meetings and decrees struggled to manage. Abroad, partners recalculated. Adversaries wondered if they were witnessing tactic or transformation. Allies wondered if guarantees still held their old shape. Reform is a race against the endurance of habits. Could a state rewire its circuitry while leaving the lights on?
A reactor accident in the Ukrainian countryside pushed invisible particles across borders and pushed a system toward candor. The explosion's plume moved with winds that ignored sovereignty. Instruments in foreign labs registered spikes before statements in official newspapers did. Villages were evacuated with haste that seemed slow to those who breathed the dust. Maps were redrawn in gradients of danger. Food supplies were tested and retested. The event became more than a catastrophe. It was a diagram of governance. The need for information collided with a culture of secrecy. The imperative to reassure collided with hard measurements. When the facts finally emerged, they undermined not only confidence in a reactor design, but also confidence in the habit of withholding. International agencies coordinated responses. Scientists exchanged data with a solidarity that flowed faster than politics. The sarcophagus of concrete poured over the ruins became a monument to the costs of denial and delay. In the years that followed, the word Chernobyl required no translation. It entered conversations as a unit of risk, a measure of how systems fail in ways that cannot be confined. If contamination makes borders irrelevant, What else might force openness where opacity once seemed strong?
By the late 1980s, information had become portable in new ways. Personal computers settled onto office desks and kitchen tables. Modems chirped as they bridged private rooms to distant servers. Cable networks braided news into a near-constant stream. Music videos exported styles as efficiently as they exported songs. Blockbuster films made the mall a universal dialect. Sports broadcasts created shared reference points across time zones. In the East, even without full access, recordings, samizdat magazines, and videotapes migrated like contraband birds, carrying images of consumption and speech that hinted at alternative futures. In the West, cultures absorbed fragments from everywhere, remixing cuisines, fashions, and slang into a cosmopolitan ordinary. Advertising sold not only products, but ways of arranging desire. Economies adjusted to just-in-time logistics and early finance automation. Borders felt more porous to capital than to people. The global whisper did not replace politics, it accelerated expectations. A citizen who has seen another city's shop window or another parliament's debate begins to calibrate his own world differently. The result was less a coordinated revolution than an erosion, steady, solvent, persistent. If longing travels at the speed of light, how fast can institutions learn to answer it?
Change, when it came to Eastern Europe, arrived like a sequence of correctives. In Poland, negotiations produced elections that opened the legislature to opposition. A coalition government followed, as astonishing in its calm as in its legality. In Hungary, fences along the Austrian border were quietly cut, and picnics became passages as East Germans discovered a route west through summer fields. In East Germany, protests filled Leipzig streets with candles and hymns, the marchers' insistence steadier than the regime's confidence. Czechoslovakia saw a theater of students and actors transform into a civic movement whose simplest demand, truth, proved tectonic. Bulgaria's leadership changed under pressure. Romania's did so in violence, the exception that proved the rule of restraint elsewhere. Moscow watched with a caution that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier, choosing not to send divisions across bridges already crowded with cameras and citizens. The unraveling wore velvet in some capitals, threadbare uniforms in others, but the pattern was unmistakable. Sovereignty returning to streets and parliaments that had rehearsed for this moment in whispers. The year turned, and with it the grammar of the map. If walls can fall without artillery, what else might open without permission?
On a November evening, a bureaucratic misstatement became a spark, and a frontier that had defined the century softened under the weight of curiosity. Checkpoints overwhelmed by citizens seeking to test new rules folded under their own uncertainty. Hammers and hands met concrete. Strangers embraced atop a structure built to prevent exactly that. Television captured the impossible turning ordinary. People strolling through gaps once covered by spotlights. Police standing unsure whether to enforce or to participate. City districts rediscovering each other like relatives after a long absence. Diplomats began the intricate work the next morning. 2+4 talks to settle legalities that stretched back to Allied victory, negotiations over currency at a rate that would make unification feel immediate and disruptive, pledges to neighboring states that borders would remain peaceful, and commitments compatible with wider European security. Trains that once stopped now ran through. Contracts that once divided now merged. Apartments that once faced walls now faced parks. Yet euphoria contained complexities. Factories built for a protected market struggled. Identities layered over decades required careful stitching. A wall can be destroyed in nights. The habits it enforced can take years to unlearn. What promises must be written to keep a bridge from sagging under happiness? Even as Germany threaded itself together, the larger Eastern Empire frayed. Republics along its edges asserted languages, flags, and parliaments that took on sovereign voices. Agreements formed and failed. A new Union Treaty was drafted with clauses that promised autonomy within a shared house. The economy staggered as price controls loosened and supply chains snapped. Queues lengthened. Savings dissolved under inflation's quiet theft. In August 1991, a coup sought to arrest the clock by detaining leaders and declaring emergency. Crowds gathered around a parliament building, defending institutions with bodies and courage. Units wavered. The coup collapsed under its own misreading of the public. What followed was acceleration. Baltic states formalized independence already practiced. Ukraine voted itself free with a margin that surprised those who had underestimated memory, and others followed, some with negotiations, some with disputes over borders, fleets, and debts. The red flag lowered from the Kremlin in a winter sunset that looked less like defeat than completion. Nuclear weapons on new soils required treaties and trust. Economies needed currency and custom. Citizens needed passports and narratives. The Cold War ended not with a surrender, but with a dispersal. If the system dissolved, did its lines on the world disappear, or did they simply change names and angles, awaiting their next reading?
The early 1990s opened with a sense of unclenching. The word transition crossed borders the way earlier decades had traded tanks. Planning ministries were disassembled or retooled. Price controls were lifted like manhole covers. Currencies were set free to find their own worth. In Central and Eastern Europe, privatization took on different tempos, vouchers in one country, auctions in another, while people learned the strange arithmetic of savings dissolving and opportunities appearing at the same time. Russia felt the shock in empty shelves and sudden fortunes.
its state enterprises, shedding workers and acquiring owners as quickly as paperwork could be stamped. Western consultants filled hotels, writing reports under lamps in rooms that smelled faintly of new carpeting and old paint. The European Union drafted the Maastricht Treaty, converting integration into a timetable with criteria that read like a shared diet. Deficits trimmed, inflation tamed, currencies prepared for a single coin that would chime across borders. In Asia, supply chains lengthened like tides at spring moon, pulling components from one coast to be assembled on another and sold on a third. In Latin America, stabilization plans battled hyperinflation with rules as stern as they were hopeful. Globalization became a household word, not for its philosophy, but for its deliveries. Yet markets without map lines still relied on power that had addresses: central banks, trade ministries, corporate boards. If the new age promised frictionless exchange, where would the heat of politics go when it had no obvious surface to grip? Where one federation unraveled along seams of language, faith, and history, the 1990s forged a grim reminder. The Cold War's end did not cancel older maps. It revealed them. Yugoslavia fractured under leaders who translated grievances into borders, and fields that had known harvests learned again the geometry of trenches. Siege and shelling returned to European vocabulary with names that would not be forgotten. Towns turned into symbols of endurance and atrocity. International organizations tested their new posture in a world without two superpower umbrellas. Peacekeepers in blue helmets, sanctions with legal teeth, tribunals that documented crimes and promised judgment. Air campaigns were justified in phrases that mixed law with necessity. Negotiations at distant bases drew lines intended to stop guns, even when they could not harmonize memories. Kosovo's crisis arrived as a later chapter, with the same footnotes: refugees on roads, ultimata, and intervention explained as the last available instrument. The war's end produced protectorates and mandates, cantonments and constitutions that sought to freeze violence into clauses. Europe absorbed the lesson with unease. That integration could expand, while fragmentation raged at its edge. If a continent engineered to dissolve borders must police them in emergency, what does it owe to the maps it inherits versus the maps it hopes to draw?
For a time, analysts spoke of a unipolar moment, as if power had seasons. The United States, unmatched in military reach and cultural export, interpreted security as management at distance. No rival peer, only turbulent regions, failed states, and proliferators to be deterred. The 1991 Gulf War displayed coalition warfare as choreography. Precision strikes, televised at night, armored columns moving across sand like rulers drawn by a steady hand. A mandate limited by design. Sanctions and inspections became tools for the decade. Regimes intended to disarm by attrition and constraint.
Peace processes were staged with handshakes and principles, their promises as fragile as the domestic coalitions that sustained them. Humanitarian interventions and non-interventions left debates that never fully ended. When to act, under whose authority, with what exit? The economy hummed, fueled by technology and the dot-com imagination, while globalization deepened habits of dependence. In this weather, the assumption took hold that history could be administered with expertise and bandwidth. But assumptions can be maps that hide cliffs. If one pole guides compasses, what happens when the needle drifts for reasons no magnet controls?
The network moved from laboratories to living rooms, from command structures to ordinary schedules. Email shortened distance. Browsers made the archive of human curiosity available in a few keystrokes. Search engines reorganized knowledge into ranked lists that felt like answers. New companies learned how to monetize attention. Old industries learned how quickly attention migrates. Borders struggled to contain this traffic. Sensors adapted, filters evolved, and users developed 1,000 workarounds in a cat-and-mouse tutorial on the politics of code. Activists organized across continents without visas. Disinformation traveled with the same velocity as truth, discovering that virality rewards emotion more than evidence. Supply chains became data chains, optimized by software that balanced inventories like equations. Finance moved faster than law, inventing instruments whose risks were invisible until they were not. Governments digitized services and surveillance, discovering that the same sensors that eased commutes could also count crowds. The dream of a borderless commons collided with states' insistence on jurisdiction, sovereignty, and tax. The Cold War's lines on paper evolved into protocols and standards. Who sets them? Who enforces them? Who gets to switch them off? If connectivity is the new oxygen, who controls the masks when the air grows thin?
A clear morning turned into a hinge of the century, and the unipolar forecast shifted to storm. The attacks were planned with the instruments of the new age: airline tickets, encrypted messages, small teams, and answered with the instruments of empire: long supply lines, expeditionary bases, alliances reactivated around article obligations, and shared intelligence. Afghanistan became again an arena, now with counterinsurgency manuals and provincial reconstruction teams. Iraq followed under premises that mixed fear of weapons with the certainty of remaking a region. Regimes fell quickly. Governance proved the slower war. Insurgencies adapted with roadside bombs and networks that regenerated like coral. The language of the era learned new idioms: homeland security, rendition, drones, surge. Civil-military doctrine oscillated between clear, hold, build, and train, advise, assist, each a translation of patience into practice. At home, Debates measured liberty against safety, transparency against tactics. Abroad, allies weighed participation against protest, and rivals watched, storing lessons on resilience and miscalculation. The open-endedness of these conflicts taught a familiar paradox: modern force can win battles faster than it learns a society. If wars stretch until politics ripens, who decides when ripeness has been reached or spoiled?
The late 2000s and 2010s reminded planners that maps still matter. Russia's recovery, helped by hydrocarbons and consolidation, was expressed in moves that redrew lines in its near abroad, testing the elasticity of post-Cold War arrangements. The annexation of a peninsula and the shadow war in a neighboring east reintroduced sanctions as a central instrument of strategy and revived NATO's eastern posture with rotations, exercises, and a jargon of readiness. In Asia, maritime claims hardened, reefs became runways, and patrols traced arcs in contested seas where law and power negotiated daily. China's rise shifted weight across every ledger: trade, technology, defense, while its Belt and Road Initiative laid infrastructure like inscriptions, binding ports and railways into a narrative of connectivity with a Chinese grammar. The Middle East rotated through civil wars and interventions with external patrons threading their interests through local actors. Syria's battlefield became a cautionary atlas of proxies. The Gulf recalibrated alliances amid price wars and diplomatic spats. Agreements were signed that normalized relations long thought impossible. Borders did not disappear. They argued. If geography had seemed asleep under networks and markets, what did its awakening say about the endurance of 1945's first lines?
A financial crisis spread outward from mortgage-backed codes into factories and paychecks, reminding citizens that contagion is not only biological. A decade later, a pandemic gave the metaphor its body, closing airports, emptying avenues, and turning masks into social mirrors. Supply chains tangled. Vaccines became instruments of diplomacy as well as medicine. Laboratories collaborated with unprecedented speed, even as misinformation built alternate epistemologies online. Climate asserted itself with fires, floods, and heat, pushing security establishments to model risks that lacked adversaries but supplied consequences. In these crises, the old Cold War alliances proved both durable and improvisational. Central banks coordinated, health agencies exchanged data, militaries delivered logistics at home. Rival powers offered aid that carried quiet arguments in each shipment. Citizens measured competence, trust, and solidarity in daily increments. The divisions of the past did not vanish. They repatterned around capacity and credibility. If uniforms are absent, but mobilization remains, what does victory look like when the enemy is not a flag, but a failure rate?
The world that followed 1945 carried its divisions forward not only in treaties, but in textbooks, museums, and rituals.
Monuments to victory and grief shaped civic calendars. National curricula taught sequences where heroes and victims took turns as guideposts. Archives opened in measured ways, allowing societies to negotiate with their ghosts. In Eastern Europe, lustration and archival access sought to balance justice with reconciliation. In Latin America, truth commissions traced lines through the fog of the disappeared. In Africa, memorials marked liberation and lament side by side. In East Asia, memory wars animated maritime claims and textbook revisions. In the Middle East, competing narratives of statehood and loss kept diplomacy circled around first principles. The post-war order thus lived inside people before it lived in buildings. Voting patterns reflected grandparents' stories. Defense budgets reflected museums' lessons. Foreign policy reflected what school children drew when asked to map their world. Memory is not only recall, but it is scaffolding. If ideas are the real borders, who tends them when the generation that built them passes away?
By the time the century turned twice from 1945, the institutions born in its wake had become furniture in the world's living room, sometimes comfortable, sometimes creaking. The United Nations continued to convene the planet with procedures that both dignified and constrained. The Bretton Woods twins adjusted formulas to new debtors and new kinds of risk. NATO expanded in waves that reflected both aspiration and anxiety. The European Union deepened and weathered crises of currency, migration, and exit without surrendering the premise of union. Technology companies grew into actors the size of ministries, regulating speech and trade flows with terms of service rather than statutes. Cities formed networks that negotiated climate and transportation beyond their national capitals. The rivalry, once defined by ideology, morphed into one that braided economics, cyber capabilities, and standards, with supply chains as contested territory and semiconductors as strategic minerals. Yet in councils across capitals, the map of 1945 still hung, sometimes literally, reminding decision-makers that origin stories anchor expectations. If structures outlast their builders, to whom do they ultimately belong? The architects, the tenants, or the generations not yet arrived with new furniture in mind? And so the story returns to its opening silence, not because the guns have stopped forever, but because history often concludes its chapters with paperwork rather than thunder. The world divided after 1945 by security needs, by doctrines, by hunger, and by hope, has not reunited so much as it has rearranged. Alliances still offer shelter and obligations. Markets still bind strangers and stratify them. Technologies still promise liberation and administer new kinds of control. Each innovation draws a faint line. Each memory darkens it. The fall of a wall felt like an ending, but the habits it trained lingered in contracts, procurement cycles, classroom maps, and the stories families tell about who protected whom and why. Today's global system, with its corridors of trade and its nodes of power,
follows paths first sketched in that exhausted year when victory tasted of ash. Understanding this does not require despair. It invites steadiness. Peace after war is rarely a poem. It is a filing cabinet, a calendar, a meeting that recurs until it feels permanent. Agreements, once signed, become weather. The divisions they encode may shift, soften, or migrate into software and sentiment, but they do not quite leave. If history ends quietly with pens and pages, what new lines are being drafted now? Lines we will only recognize decades later when someone else listens for the silence after thunder.